This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our friends at Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system.
Is your cannabis company's SOPs tied directly to your cultivation plans? Can you easily manage your inventory and workforce and vendors from a single system? Or can you efficiently manage regulatory compliance across multiple states and licenses? If the answer is no, then you need to stop what you're doing and talk to the team at Regrow. Regrow is the first of its kind software that leverages components of leading ERP and supply chain management systems with the necessary compliance of the cannabis industry. Essentially, Regrow is the single pane of glass view into your entire supply chain that is built to automate manual tasks, reduce costs, and avoid shortages by creating dynamic workflows that maximize yields and increase profitability for your business. Visit their website at regrow.io. That's regrow.io. Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mattio Communications.
Hey there, my fellow people of the plant. Let's talk a moment about brand awareness in the cannabis space. The industry is obviously becoming more crowded as it matures. So how do you effectively break through the noise? We all know that cannabis marketing has restrictions that make our jobs more difficult. But thankfully, the kick-ass PR and marketing professionals at Mattio Communications know how to elevate your narrative while staying compliant. Their New York and LA-based teams have the connections and powerful storytelling abilities you need to propel your business onto the national stage. Mattio refuses to let your bold innovations and ambitious breakthroughs fall through the cracks. They'll get your company in front of your most prized audiences via their various specialties, which include PR, social media, investor relations, SEO, and more. Mattio shares your vision of normalizing cannabis for the greater good of society. They proudly partner with businesses across the industry, from investors and ancillary companies to large MSOs and local brands. No matter your business goals, Mattio is here to help. Email them today at info@mattio.com. That's info@mattio.com, or visit mattio.com to get your company the recognition it deserves.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Relevant.
I've said it before, podcasting is a great medium because it allows me to educate myself and others about cannabis. But in most cases, the conversation is usually one way for the listeners. But not anymore. A new app called Relevant is the place to unite our community and connect with each other. Relevant is an open messaging network where you can join live audio chat communities called Vibes. You can discover and join any vibe you find interesting. Then grab the live mic and voice your opinion freely about any topic related to the community while others join in or group chat. You can even create your own vibe for sports teams, podcasts, fan clubs, comedy, classes, and anything else you can imagine. So find your vibe today by downloading the Relevant app, available on the App Store and Google Play. That's Relevant, RELEVNT. No dead vibes, only good vibes with the Relevant app. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry-facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guest today is Emily Paxhia. She's the co-founder and managing partner at Poseidon Asset Management. The one and only Emily Paxhia, how are you?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for responding to my tweet. I took my shot, after the Cannabis Confidential Clubhouse meeting where the women of cannabis took center stage, and I heard you speak along with the other female leaders, and I got to tell you, I was like, I got to have her on, and I'm going to be reaching out to the other ladies as well. So thank you for agreeing.
Yeah, thank you for that was a really fun night. I had a great time on that Clubhouse.
Yeah, those Clubhouse meetings have been so informative, specifically on the financial side, right? Because there's just so much action going on within the cannabis markets right now. So, having Rosie and Todd and all those guys just put that on every week is just super beneficial to the industry. So,
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, let's kick it off, Emily. And why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about your background? I know from what I've read, your Poseidon Asset Management is run by you and your brother. So Like, tell me, like, what made you guys get interested in cannabis? Were you prior advocates and consumers of the plant? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting path, and I'd say it's kind of a two-pronged path. The first part is it's, sometimes unfortunate events in your life put you on a trajectory that you don't see the wisdom of it at the time, but then you realize later on that some good things come from some really bad things. But so my brother and I, we lost both of our parents to cancer in 1996 and then in 2001. And we grew up in Buffalo, New York, which now New York is legal.
Yeah.
But it yeah, and at the time it wasn't. And so we had heard from a hospice nurse, like kind of through conversation in our house, because we had hospice people basically living with us, especially with my dad in our early days. And she had mentioned, this is essentially like kind of off the cuff, like palliative care resource. And so it stuck with us. So I think that was a thing that kind of created a openness to taking cannabis more seriously than I think other people do. Um, Fast forward to went to school on the East Coast, lived in Boston, New York, super illegal there. Not even
Right.
just a little bit illegal, but extremely illegal. Moved to California in 2011. And I remember I was riding in a car over the Golden Gate Bridge looking at the SF gate, and I saw advertisements for local cannabis retailers or dispensaries, medical shops. And
Yeah.
so I started to look into it. I was like, this is insane. You can go be a member of a club and buy cannabis. And so I started to look into it, and that's when I called my brother. And I remember where I was walking. I live actually right around the corner from the Grateful Dead house
Oh,
in
nice.
Upper Haight area. Yeah. And I was walking down Ashbury Street, and I called my brother and I said, I feel like this is the opportunity of our generation. Like thinking back to, Steve Jobs in his garage, thinking back to these different defining moments of generational opportunities, or the pro alcohol prohibition on the backside. And we know Ben Kovler's family has a history with that. So
Mhm.
yeah, called him up, and my brother and I have always worked well together in the setting of life, and we talked about being entrepreneurs together in various contexts, and this was really clearly our path. So the fact that he took me seriously on that phone call tells me everything about our alignment and our ability to be trailblazers on something so at the time precarious as this. So
He was all about it. I'm guessing, right? It didn't sound like there was any hesitation on his end. He's like, let's do this. Yes, I'm in.
unflinching. Well, it was, I give him 100% credit, because I was like, I don't know how to participate in this industry. We have to figure out, like, are we going to build a business? And so we looked at all of these different business verticals, which actually did end up informing a lot of our early investment thesis of the sub sectors of cannabis. But
Sure.
Morgan was the one who, with his very traditional finance, I was a consultant and researcher before that. Morgan was a strict finance, and he was the one who identified the need for an actively managed portfolio of companies where investors could look to people who were focused on this, and companies would need funding, and we'd put this together. So it was his notion and his idea to do the fund.
Right.
So I thought, so we brought two things together just like we always seem to do. So
And you just, I mean, you both bring certain skill sets to the table, as you mentioned, where you knew that it'd be a good partnership, good team, right? Dynamic.
yeah.
And when you formed Poseidon Asset Management, what I read, that was the number one or the longest operating fund in the cannabis industry, right? Was it the first?
So, I mean, our lawyers would say you can't say it's the first, because you never know if someone technically for it. But really, yeah, I think we are. If we're not the first, we're one of the first. But we're the first with real. I mean, we've had fully audited financials. We've had third party back office administration. We've run this thing as like an institution from the beginning.
Hmm.
Institutional capital has not been able to participate because of the schedule of cannabis, and we all know about that and the implications that has. But we thought we're going to not just launch a fund, we're going to launch a fund on an institutional level and run it like an institutional firm should be run. And we felt like if we built the foundation that way, that we'd then be able to build and build and build. And we just launched our third fund. We've run 7 direct investment syndicates alongside of our other investments, and it's a great platform, and I'm so immensely proud of the work, because it has not been easy. There's no day that this is easy ever.
No, I mean, being a business owner and entrepreneur has its own unique set of challenges and whatnot to begin with, right? But then if you talk about the cannabis industry and all the red tape and hoops that you have to jump through, I've said it before and I'll say it time and time again. You know, cannabis operators are the most resilient
Mhm.
business owners in any, you know, when it comes to any industry, just because of all those little nuances that they have to keep up with and address every single day, you know.
Yep.
But what you touched on, you nailed the nail on the head when you said that you saw this generational opportunity. You saw that this was just a burgeoning industry where it was just there's so many different facets of it that are just going to kind of emerge, right? And that was kind of my initial thinking too. I remember going in January of 2020 to the Texas Hemp Convention and walking in there and looking around at like all the different vendors, the extraction, you know, lab equipment, the flower over here. And I was just thinking, God, like, where do I fit in? Right. And I think I've even tweeted this, that I believe that cannabis is going to be the main industry catalyst for entrepreneurs, like up and coming entrepreneurs in years to come, you know? So, let's talk about like all of the opportunities that cannabis presents first and foremost. You know, speaking from an economic, medicinal, health and wellness, and environmental standpoint, and then we'll get into some other things. But from your perspective, like, you know, you mentioned the word yourself, generational opportunity. So tell me what that means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that this is going to have, when people look back on the development of the legal cannabis industry in this modern era. Look, we know there was a hemp industry before basically it got shut down and pushed aside, and we know there were political and economic reasons for that, such as the logging industry and our good friend out here who owned, all of the media. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Is it
Anyway,
Harry
it's
Anslinger?
Oh, well, Anslinger was, yeah, he was responsible for he was reefer madness laws. And then there was oh gosh, who's the famous millionaire of eras in the past? Oh
I'm
God.
I'm spacing it. It's okay. We'll
Me
come
too.
back. Yeah.
We'll come back. But he owns like all of the California publications, and he was huge in the logging industry. And we think he was a big driver to get industrial hemp out of this country, and to flush it down with the reefer madness of cannabis. But I mean, we know the roots of it. It's all very racist and unbelievable the way that this has been pushed into the category that it presently still lives in, which is insane.
Right.
But I think that when we think about bringing and yet people continued to consume cannabis. There was no time when people were like, we're good. But instead, ordinary citizens like you and me
Right.
broke the law to procure and consume cannabis. It's a fact, and a lot of people did that.
Right.
So this is the whole thing. So if we can, I've always thought of this as like flipping an iceberg. The majority of this industry has been pushed underground, and we've seen like the tiny little tip of it as this iceberg. If we just flip this thing into a legal and regulated market, it's enormous. The potential of it is enormous. And I can't help but reflect on what's happened for the last 12 months with the pandemic, even what's happening with the Suez Canal the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think about, and now they're saying there's hundreds of container ships sitting off coast of LA because now there's all this backlog. And globalization's been fantastic. But maybe as a country, we should think about bringing our domestic product, our GDP back to the US. We should think about the things that are tangible to drive growth within the four walls of not just our country, but our continent. I can't help but think about Canada, Mexico, both going to have legal programs at the federal level. And here we are, the middle of the sandwich, totally bumming everybody out. But it's like, I can't help but think about the localization of all of this. And that includes industrial hemp coming back in many
Right.
big ways. And we know that many corporations, because we're involved in some of this, are coming back to seeing this as part of the way they want to manufacture goods going forward in many, many different sectors. But so, yeah, that's the way we thought about it. Is like it brings job creation, it brings tangible experiences to people. It's like if you can look at what happened in Napa Valley when they
Mm-hmm.
flipped over from being just Chablis to they won, the competition on Cabernet and brought all of this interest to Northern California. I mean, it completely changed the economics of Northern California, where they were growing just fruit trees, and now they flipped it all the way into this amazing burgeoning economy. And I don't see why we can't do that with cannabis, and
Right.
on a bigger scale, because I love wine and I love wine and spirits, but you can't really say there's a medicinal benefit to it.
No.
You can't say there's a wellness benefit to it,
No,
really.
and you can't make a house out of wine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I try every day. I have wine coming out of my ears, but I can't do it. I
maybe
can't
maybe
build
with
my house.
maybe with the
Yeah.
bottles, you can build a house, but not the actual liquid.
And we shouldn't do it on a fault line, that's for sure. But I think it is it's remarkable because cannabis, like, it lives on this spectrum of pure pharma through wellness through lifestyle, which is where I kind of picture, people talk about it recreational, I talk about it lifestyle. It's like
Sure.
you're choosing to augment your lifestyle with cannabis, just like you do with other things you consume or experience. So um that's why I think it's going to be a seismic shift in the way we approach wellness. I think people are looking to take control of their health and wellness into their own hands, and
Hmm.
not wait to become ill, and not wait to have to rely on pharmaceutical drugs. So I think this is a huge part of that, and we've seen it too, frankly, with this huge movement around psychedelics as opposed to opioids and certain things
Hmm.
for dealing with trauma. So really important shifts there. I think that it's bringing entire jobs back to the US. It's one of the biggest points of pride. Like, for example, with Ascend, one of the companies we're invested in, one of the facilities that we turned on in Western Mass had the workers had gone on strike. It was a tooling facility. They'd gone on strike over 2 decades ago, put their tools down, and walked out. When we walked into that facility before we completely renovated it, there were literally just it was almost like a ghost ship. It was like
Wow.
tools, and this was an economy in Western Massachusetts that had been completely depressed without any new job creation, and now it's thriving again. And I
Right.
feel like these are the things that I think about. I think about the wellness shift. I think about the shift in job creation. And I think innovation around cannabis cultivation will lead to innovation in other forms of crops as well, that we need to desperately consider when you consider the state of the planet today.
Yeah. I mean, you made so many great points. And I want to unpack some of them because they're worth doing so, right? I mean, the analogy that you give about the iceberg and how it's upside down and there's this massive, block of ice that's underwater that we don't see and we only see the tip. That is so spot on. I haven't heard a better analogy than that. I might even steal it if that's okay.
Take it.
I'll cite you on it, but it's so true because we are already understanding the opportunity that's presented when it comes to the economic benefits. You talked
Mhm,
about job creation, uh, tax revenue, the economic impact of this money just going in with consumers buying, right?
mhm,
But then we also have the environmental benefits, right? I mean, the cannabis plant itself is one of the most organic plants that you can grow. If you want to grow anything organic, grow hemp first because it enriches the soil, it takes in so many CO2 emissions. And then also we don't talk about it enough, but the restorative justice component, right? And you mentioned it earlier about so many people's lives have been destroyed from this plan, and righting those wrongs. And
mhm.
so isn't it just fascinating to when you lay out all those benefits and clearly as concisely as you did, um isn't it just hilarious to see some policymakers still try to use the same tactics and use the same ridiculous claims that they even did back in the Reefer Madness days? Like, I mean, as of recent, there's been so many different politicians and whatnot saying things, and I can't help but just retweet it, take a screenshot, and laugh because I don't think that works nowadays. People are too smart for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's selective ignorance. It's choosing. It's like Ben Kovler says, new facts are hard, gang. And
Right.
I threw in gang, but he says new facts are hard. But I think that, and that's I have a very small tolerance or low tolerance for choosing not to become informed.
Right.
And it is one of those things where, like, I have a lot of respect for Sanjay Gupta because he used to be not in favor of cannabis, but he's obviously very science minded and a well-educated human being. So are many of these other insane human beings, though. And he chose to be open-minded and to learn. And it was Charlotte Figge, frankly, who really brought him along from Charlotte's Web. And I mean, first of all, we owe a debt of gratitude to Charlotte Figge, because her type of story with the epilepsy and seeing what she went through, and then seeing the like almost 180-degree change in her life to the better just through cannabis is, I mean, if you can't be moved by seeing a child whose life is improved at that level, and I'm so grateful she had good years before she ended up passing away, which is so sad. But Sanjay Gupta changed his entire opinion and felt so moved and compelled to then highlight it in his series, which was so, back when we first launched the fund, whenever someone was like, "Ugh, you guys are drug dealers, you're getting into this negative industry," I would just send them those links. I would just be like, please just
Hmm.
watch this. Like, just watch it and tell me how you feel after seeing this. And that's the thing. I used to say, when Jeff Sessions became the attorney general and he rescinded the Cole memo, I was like, just give me an hour in a room with that guy. Just give me an hour in a room with that guy. I will inform him of his wrongs. But
That's how I feel about Kevin Sabet.
oh my Lord. Oh, I've sat with him. And you know what?
Does he
He's better
believe
than,
that shit? Does he really believe it, what he says?
he was actually in pretty good form when he sat across the table with me. I was there with Cassandra Farrington from the Drug Policy Alliance. She's an incredible human being. But he was better than Alex Berenson. Alex Berenson was just making things up, and I was sitting next to the president of the ABA, the American Bankers Association, and I mean, this guy was awesome because he wasn't pro cannabis, but he was pro getting cannabis into the legal bank system for transparency and tracking. He's like, we built the banking system to make it better and safer for people to transact and for us to collect all the taxes. Like, this is the best thing we could do. So, but he's not pro cannabis, but the two of us sat across from Alex Berenson and kind of went head to head with him. But actually, it made Kevin Savitt seem like kind of a,
Like
like,
nice or yeah.
yeah, like, I don't even know, like, but I've been frustrated with his recent thing. And then that, I can't even remember, was it the governor of Nebraska
Oh
who
yeah,
made
his literal words were, "If you legalize marijuana, you're gonna kill your kids." That's what he said on record. Yeah,
and it's so backwards.
right.
It's so backwards. We know legalizing and regulating it makes it harder to get into the hands of kids than it ever was. And I mean, I think we all know it was a lot easier to get our hands on some illegal cannabis than it was to get our hands on alcohol when we
That's
were
what I
growing
was.
up.
That's what I was just gonna say. Like newsflash, guys. Like it's super easy for any kid in high school to get cannabis. Not saying it's right. Not saying that's just the way it is, though. It's much
Yeah,
easier to get it than alcohol. Like you're saying, you have to have somebody go and buy alcohol for you, right? Like,
it's a
um,
real production.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta call this out because we're speaking about funny tweets of ridiculous claims. The one that is my favorite so far from yesterday is Greg Kelly,
Oh,
um, and he said smoking weed, aka grass, and he uses a lot of caps too in certain weird areas. But he goes, smoking weed, aka grass, is not a good idea. I tried it back in the day, and it was worse in all caps than anything that had happened to Hunter Biden, who smoked crack. I toked up with buddies in Kentucky and woke up 4 days later in Nairobi, Kenya, with no idea what happened. Don't do drugs. So somebody needs to tell Greg Kelly that he smoked PCP,
yeah.
or something that was not cannabis, because that doesn't happen when you smoke cannabis. You don't
Yeah,
black out.
you don't black out and you don't well, first of all, I was like, wait a minute. I'd love to go to sleep in Kentucky and wake up in Nairobi, Kenya. Like, where's the downside to that? I'm dying to get to Kenya. Like, and so if I have a nice long cannabis nap on on the road to find out, like, sign me up. I don't know. I was like, first, yes, I agree. And the people's responses to that were amazing. It was just like everybody was just like, that was not cannabis, whatever
Yeah,
you got yourself into. And
yeah.
that,
You don't.
I mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, that alone is like the reason to legalize and regulate it, because then if you are a dum dum and you were born in a, shoebox and not educated or informed or like interacted with any human beings, you'd know whatever it is that you're smoking is not cannabis.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so I'm just going to
Yeah,
continue to call these out as I see them because, again, from my perspective and anybody who's like people of the plant that understand it, it's so laughable and so off base that,
yeah.
it's just, we need to call that out. They can't get away with
It
that
just
stuff.
looks silly. It does,
Yeah.
at this point, it just looks silly because it's uninformed.
Right. So let's switch gears, Emily, and let's
Yeah,
talk about the current political landscape in the country. You talked about how Canada is already legal. They were the first of the seven nations to go
yeah.
alive with adult use cannabis, and then you have Mexico now, who's in their final stages of legalization across the board. So you're in it every day. You're talking to these policymakers. I mean, you're an industry leader. What is really going on? Like we see Chuck Schumer in the Senate pushing reform, talking about legalization. So that's awesome. And then you see moves by the Biden administration to fire staffers for previous use, not even if it's in their system. So that to me is like a clear, like he's making a statement, right? So like, what is going on? What's happening?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I know, so we do, spend a lot and someone on our team, Mike, is on the board of California Cannabis Industry Association. So he's very involved in Sacramento. We all have spent time on the Hill. Mike especially has spent time on the Hill more recently, which is a very informing experience to spend time with the staffers and with the lawmakers.
Hmm.
I mean, it's so fascinating how this issue, which polls so well across the entire country,
Right.
both and both party lines.
Yeah,
It's so
Texas 61% of voters want legalization
yeah,
in Texas, you know?
yeah. It's and it's kind of like it's interesting because it lands in almost a libertarian space too. So there's people who want it, and then there's the people who are like, I don't care about it, but it shouldn't be illegal because you shouldn't tread on people's rights and their rights to choose in the state and everything. And then there are the people who are against it, and usually it's because of the the long and waging war on drugs and all of the misinformation about it and the way it gets lumped in with other things. So there's a lot of hard wiring that has to be undone. And unfortunately, we have some of the oldest lawmakers in the whole wide world right now. I mean, we have old people running this country. And so
Right.
I think they have old and outdated ideas around how cannabis functions and what the repercussions of it are, which, as we know now, it has a net positive to society where it is legalized in almost every form and fashion.
Right.
But I think that I think, for example, last year being an election year, one of the big things was people were not necessarily opposed to the Safe Banking Act, but it was a pawn in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the political negotiations that were going on. And so,
Yep.
yeah, it was kind of being held hostage as an issue, which
When
was
that
frustrating.
and that legislation should stand on its own, right? I mean,
Yeah,
like it did seem to be, I agree with you. It did seem to be politicized quite a bit, and it almost was a detriment to the industry in a way, right? Because
yeah,
it sets you back. Every
it puts
time
you
that you're
back.
putting that forward, it sets you back. It sets you back. So
Yeah.
but we've heard rumblings of like safe banking maybe coming this month. Have you heard any rumblings on that?
We're hearing good things about safe banking, but I think all of us in the investor landscape and actually the industry are kind of like a boy who cried wolf on this issue a bit. So I
Yeah.
think it's the bloom is off the rose a little bit on safe banking, just from the way people feel about it. It's kind of like, yeah, wake me up when it's actually done, like, and in the short term, the industry keeps moving forward in spite of it. That's the thing, is you said it very well too, is that this industry, in spite of its challenges, continues to push forward, and I think it just makes people better operators. And when things get easier, these businesses are going to look all the much more better. But I think, I do think that there are actual, like, Schumer definitely wants to see change.
Hmm.
I think there
I
are,
get that from him. I get that.
yeah,
Yeah.
Booker, there are people who really do want to see change in our lawmakers. They do. The Biden administration, it's interesting, when we didn't know how the election would turn out, everyone asked us, well, Biden will be a slam dunk for the industry, and we were like, not necessarily. He doesn't have a great track record around it. And I am frankly really disappointed by what came out of the White House the last few weeks, because it seems unnecessary. Like, just
Exactly.
at least Trump left it alone.
Exactly. That's
I
why I
think
said,
probably the best thing. Yeah.
yeah, that's why I said it seemed like a statement. He didn't need to do that. You know what I mean?
No.
Like,
Yeah.
so
And I'm disappointed in Kamala Harris on that because she also has a checkered background in terms of how she's handled cannabis as an issue and criminal justice reform around it.
which people
Um,
forget about. People forget about that. But yeah, she locked up a lot of people who use cannabis back in the day.
she did, and look, it's never an easy position to be in where she was
Sure.
sitting at that time, but nonetheless, I thought this was. I mean, she came out pretty strongly in favor of decrim on this for this election, which was a very smart move because there are a lot of people who support it. But now I'm a little worried that we got the lip service leading into the election and we're not going to get the support that we need at the executive branch level. So I'm pretty disappointed by it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's to me, it's just kind of a weak and again, like I have a very low tolerance for not observing the information and the facts. So
And it's especially when we go back to that analogy of the iceberg and how
yeah,
humongous this is, right? And at that point, like you said, I am totally with you because I'm the same. I get super frustrated when there's a resistance to open your mind and be more open to certain things, even if you don't want to be around it, if you don't want to consume it, right? But
yep,
understand the human benefits that this
yep,
presents, right?
yep.
Um, so it's frustrating there, but then it's even more frustrating if it's not ignorance and if it's these policymakers protecting certain interests.
Oh yeah, I mean, without
You know,
question. And that's something we've been watching forever, the role of pharma, the role of the wine and spirits industry, like what's that going to be? And we're keeping an eye on it. I think it's an important thing to keep an eye on, but all of that aside, I mean, our hope is we get safe banking, we get some, I mean, really decrim at the federal level, descheduling, any of that. I honestly, our bet is not on federal
right,
legalization. That's
right,
not our bet. Our
right.
bet is on let the states do their thing, but stop locking up people disproportionately for it, and give us banking. All we want is to be able to bank this industry. It is not a big ask, and I couldn't say enough about how the ABA has been a big supporter of that too. It's really impressive.
That's great.
So, yeah,
That's encouraging to hear. Yeah, and the final point on this, and then we can switch is, and maybe I'm looking too much into it, but because this is what we're living and breathing every day. But with the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's remarks yesterday when he talked about how decrim and legalization are interchangeable words. Um, Again, maybe I'm just thinking too much into it, but like from our perspective, those are two totally different things. But I guess the way he justified it was in the federal government's eyes, decrim allows for the states to go fully legal, which is basically the States Act, right? Is that what
yep.
he meant?
I'm not. I actually need to unpack what he meant because I don't see it the same at
Okay.
all.
Yeah, I don't
Because
either.
legalization, unfortunately, means that then there's going to be federal laws around it, and I'm concerned. I mean, that is a bear case for me
Right.
because what if that means they change it to Schedule 2? What if all of a sudden the FDA is all fingers in the mix on this? That's not great either.
THC caps or whatever, right? Like anything could happen at that point.
Exactly. So there's a lot. Yes. There also this like thing that a lot of folks didn't pay attention to, which is in the MORE Act about importing of cannabis. That's something to watch. That's
Because
not something that MSOs
and that
should want.
opens up commerce, right, from other countries to. So yeah, there's a lot of little nuances here that we all got to get straight on, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you speak about the MSOs, let's talk about Poseidon and its portfolio, right? So
Yeah.
I know that y'all are really heavy when it comes to the ancillary businesses, technology. You got a big focus on technology companies. So why don't you give us an overview of your, portfolio companies and what Poseidon looks at when it comes to investing in MSOs or even single state operators?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. So broadly speaking, Poseidon has invested across almost all of the subsectors of the industry, I'd say. We haven't done very much in this biosynthesis actually at all. But that's because it's just a different timeline than what we've been investing on. But we've invested in the US, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and Europe. And so, and we approach it differently depending on where we're investing. So if we're investing into the international markets, we're investing into what I would consider way more on the medical end of the spectrum. Like we like to invest into GMP operators with infrastructure where they can plug in to distribute globally and where they have IP around cannabinoid compounds and form factors. So that's how we think about the international market. And a lot of that is because it's been dictated by, for example, how Germany has approached what they will allow to enter into their market. And I think Germany is kind of like a best in class approach to these types of issues. And so I think if Germany sets the bar there, if we can meet the bar there with our companies that we invest in, then we'll do just fine wherever else we want to distribute into. So it's like meet the bar of Germany, and we can survive from there.
And Clever Leaves would kind of be an example of a company like that, right?
Clever Leaves, Grupo Landsteiner Scientific in Mexico. There's a range of them that we've done. But yeah, Clever Leaves we were in it when it was Northern Swan. I visited their facility in Portugal, which was beautiful. Andres on our team, who is actually from Bogota, Colombia, he was down and he got to visit their facilities down in Colombia. Very impressive team. So.
Yeah. Very impressed. I had Kyle Detweiler on, the CEO of Clever Leaves, and I was very impressed with the cash that they have and their strategy. It's different, than the traditional MSOs, but it's unique. They're uniquely positioned. Yeah.
Yep. And so it's interesting. And so I feel like there's a whole global supply chain that we can participate. When we were early in Canada, we were in Afria before it went public. And our thesis there was high quality, low cost to produce cannabis. And that was a really great thesis. We played through that. And then, when they hit some of their early highs in the upper teens. So we went from like under $1 to, like $18 a share on that thing, and then rotated capital back into the US, where we started to see, our early days of what are now considered the MSOs. And so we were like, okay, here comes the US opportunity. It's starting to make sense. Back when we first started investing into MSOs, it wasn't even clear if you could create a consolidated business with multiple states underneath. It was not, because most of them, I don't know if people realize this, but like a GTI had different entities in different states. And it wasn't just one. Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Wow.
It was early days, and we didn't know. We were like, can this work where you have a corporate infrastructure that reaches across multiple states with this subsidiary entities? And I think they were one of the first ones to really approach it. Who else was early? Probably Cresco. I'm trying to think, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion that you could have what is now the MSO model. At that time, there was early days pioneering legal work that got us to the stage that we're at.
Right.
So that's when we started to rotate into that. And our thesis again was like, let's focus on, prudence with capital. Picking, asset selection is critical in terms of these multi-state operators. You can't just pick an asset in any old market. And also really spending time on the ground and understanding the push and pull of every legal state framework is another key piece of it. Because, if you really have to think through how it can go against you. And I'll give an example of this. We invested early in Washington State. Washington State, a lot of people may not realize, it was Colorado, Washington, and Alaska that actually had the first adult use programs legalized in the US. It was Colorado opened in January of 2014, and Washington, I want to say, was July of 2014. When Washington opened, they had a cap on cultivation. And that was an important part to our thesis in investing up there, because you couldn't invest into the entire vertical. You had to pick different players because you couldn't have both. So, or you could invest, but you'd have to pick different players. You couldn't invest in one group that was doing everything. And so then next thing we knew, after about a year of being in that investment, Washington just blew their cap wide open. And so then you had retailers running their own businesses. You had all of this cultivation that opened up, and the retailers held all the pricing power. So it absolutely collapsed the pricing of the cultivation market.
So,
And
so you're saying
yeah,
they had a, sorry to stop you. So I just want to clarify. So you're saying that they had a cap initially for cultivation licenses, and then they decided to just not have a cap anymore. And so there was probably a surplus of product that wasn't getting into the retail stores fast enough.
yes. And that the retailers controlled the pricing power on.
Wow.
So it
Okay.
was so competitive. It was a supply demand explosion.
Right.
So, and what's more is there had been actually even a canopy cap, and then that was just blown open. So we've survived. There's been a mass extinction event up there in terms of cultivators, but and we were in the top five. Both of our guys were in the top five, so they're still there. But it has, I mean, it's not been pretty. And that was a big learning for us in terms of play through what happens if you're getting into these limited license markets, the people you're selecting, the business models you're participating in, the aspects of the vertical you're participating in, play through if something like that should happen again. And
Right.
that's been a big thesis around our selection on operators and how
Right.
we participate. Yeah.
That's what it seems like. The cannabis industry is just prime for like lessons learned. You know,
Yes.
like right
Yes.
now, like that example you gave of like being a multi-state operator, like you said, different states have different regulatory compliance frameworks, right? And so you can learn from each of these things, even when the states that are coming online to be adult use. You would think that these legislators would, and I'm not saying that they aren't, but like I know New Mexico recently legalized, and their whole framework is completely different than anything I've seen in the country, and
Yep.
not good or bad. I don't. It's interesting is the word I'll use. But like their system, when you talk about caps and canopy count, I think they're doing they called it a market equilibrium system. So it's like a tiered system. So
Hmm.
you'll have like caps the first year, and then
Hmm.
they give you more plant count the second
Yep.
year, the third year you get more plant count, and then by the fourth
Yep.
year it's opening to the races, right? What do you think
Yeah.
about that structure?
I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, it's a step up, right? So it's you're stepping through market demand. I mean, it's artificially distorting the market to begin with because these doors open and there's never enough cannabis in any of these states. It's
Right.
just the fact. And so then you have this crazy pricing situation going on, which has benefited all of our operators, but it's still like it's crazy. But now we have been investing for 7 years. We have 7 years of data to track how these markets open, what happens on pricing, what happens on different, and we're religious about using our headset dashboard, our data dashboard. I mean, there's so many pieces of information we have available to us now that drive our investment decisions. I can't even believe when we first launched this fund, we had such little, our first fund, we had so little information. But now, I mean, we can even watch things like on different product categories. I can watch how inventory levels are building up in states. Which, what does that tell
Wow.
me? It tells me that it's not selling through, and it tells me that a category of product is not getting the traction and growth that maybe a lot of people think it might be. So there's a lot of things. Um, there are a lot of things to consider, but that's how we think about it. So we think about how, I mean, because right now the regulatory framework it's our friend and our foe because it keeps us contained as an industry. It allows these operators to continue to grow without a lot of corporate interference of these
Right.
bigger entities at this time.
Which is good for the
Um,
average investor because
yeah.
you're growing with the company.
Yeah. And then but it also creates a lot of challenges, right?
Right.
Like, for example, economies of scale we don't get to achieve because maybe you can't have the same packaging. Like if you're an MSO, you may have to have different packaging depending on each of your different states.
Right.
Forget the labeling, the testing, I mean, all of the different nuances. So but yet it's again the point we always make, which is that, okay, so you go through all of that and you can still drive like very attractive EBITDA as compared to other consumer product categories. It's pretty amazing
Hmm.
when you think about it.
No, it absolutely is. And I want to get your thoughts on, you mentioned Ben Kovler earlier, CEO of GTI,
Yeah.
which is part of Poseidon's portfolio. And Ben responded to one of my tweets the other day, and it was day one, because we've seen within the MSO, the capital markets in cannabis, you know, we've kind of seen that volatility kind of settle, right? And so what's happening right now in the capital markets? Like, why is there this kind of bearish approach, would you say, as opposed to, the more bullish approach that we were seeing before?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we just don't. Okay, there's a few factors. We just don't have a very deep bench in on the investor base in the cannabis industry. There's the very active, investors that we all see on Twitter, and I have to say, doing a great job of kind of running through these names and understanding the differences. Because what is important to understand now is that not all cannabis companies are the same. So they always used to move in sympathy, but they don't need to. Like the way MedMen moves doesn't have to be how GTI moves, and the
Right.
way that Trulieve moves doesn't have to be how Acreage moves. They're all different companies, and they all have different qualities that drive them forward. And I even saw someone breaking it down really interestingly the other day about like Curaleaf's focus on like wholesale, GTI, and it's just there's different ways that these groups are excelling in different, and it's going to be great to see how they all win in different ways.
Right.
So I think, but I just think there are not enough investors at the table, and I think that the fact that these companies are traded on the OTC markets or Canadian exchanges makes it just harder. There's just not the same liquidity. You can't just like pop into your Robinhood app the same way and just
I know.
have as many people coming in. You just don't have the same institutional support around it, which creates like a lot of liquidity. It creates a lot of volume in the trading. And you can just look at the Canadian counterparts, who I just don't consider to be the same quality of operators or as interesting of businesses. And yet they have a ton of volume, a ton of activity every day, and their stocks move no matter what happens. Like New York announces and they move. But I think it's just because there's access to those names on the exchanges. And so I think that's just it. So we see this periodically where there's like a cycling of capital through our industry. And I think this was a little bit of a nasty bear test that we just went through for a couple of weeks here. And I'm hoping that we'll start. It's okay. It was running really hot. It makes me nervous when things run too hot for too long, because we do have to just make sure we stay within a rational framework. And then, so we'll have these kind of ebbs and flows, and we can readjust and keep going. But I just don't think there's enough people at the table. I just don't think there are enough dollars. That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And then, the exposure issue within the, financial cable network, like CNBC, Jim Cramer and all that. Like my question for you is that they tend to favor the Canadian LPs over the MSOs. And I think two things of why, right? The first is just the awareness factor that you mentioned. Like,
Hmm.
these MSOs are not listed on the American exchanges, or they're not available on Robinhood to easily trade them, right? Or is it because cannabis is federally illegal and institutions like banks can't work with cannabis companies? Is it the same situation for these cable networks? Because if they were promoting MSOs, it would be a risk factor for that corporation, right? Because again,
Yeah.
cannabis is illegal. Do you think it's that, or is it the awareness factor, or maybe a bit of both?
I think it could be a bit of both. I mean, I was on CNBC in, was it December? I can't remember. It was December or something, or 20. And the first question was like, why are the cannabis stocks all doing badly? And I was like, which stocks are you talking about? I mean, this was like GTI, TerraSen, like the US MSOs were like, all green. It was amazing. And I was like,
Right.
what are you talking about? They're not all doing bad. And so I was like, you know what? I'm refusing to answer the questions. And I just started talking about the US, because I was like, I will
Good.
not talk about this. And I feel like that's been kind of the approach that Ben Kovler has taken, and some of the other like Kim, I think that other people, Kim Rivers,
Kim
I feel
Rivers,
like
yeah.
there's other people who've taken that approach where it's like, why would I talk about this? I mean, New York legalizing cannabis has a direct impact on a very specific set of companies
Right.
immediately, not forever, but immediately it
At
has a
home.
specific effect
At home.
right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I do think there's stakeholders in those organizations. I used to do consulting for Viacom. I mean, there's stakeholders in all
Right.
of these organizations, and so there's a lot of politics in the background there. But it is unbelievably frustrating, and it also just kind of is a ding on the credibility of the people involved there. It
Right.
really is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, hey, but it's for the investors that are in it. I mean, it's good for us because we know about this best kept secret. That's about to just emerge on everyone else throughout the world pretty soon here. So
Yeah,
it's an
it
exciting
is a
time. Go
It
ahead.
is. It's actually kind of a great opportunity for once where retail investors can get in front of institutional investors to get a bite of these things. And then you can just look at the targets for where they go if they get uplisted, which they're all preparing to do. The
Yep.
cost of their capital is going down. And I think it's a great opportunity for individual investors to really jump in and have that. And us too, I mean, it it stinks. We have to report, the performance of our fund. It's not fun when the markets go down, except that we can buy the dip.
Right. Exactly.
It's an opportunity for us to buy in because we're also very disciplined about when we enter these names. Like we will not buy when it's running hot. We won't.
Right. Right.
So for us, it's like a double-edged sword because it goes down and then you have to kind of like suffer through, that. But at the same time, it does give you an opportunity to upsize your positions.
Yeah. Buy it at the discount because they're not going to be,
Yeah.
this price is very long. That's for sure.
No.
I want to give a shout out to the MSO gang. I know that some people within the MSO gang on Twitter had some questions. So first question, you did mention the situation of it turning bearish. If
Yep.
within the MORE Act, we talked about if that legislation would have passed where there's open commerce, right? And we talked about Canada already being legal, and then Mexico's about to be legal. So that would just cause a lot of complexity and conflict, here at home when we have great multi-state operators that are already operating, right?
Yeah.
What are other bearish, examples that could currently happen within the MSO cannabis industry? Other bearish scenarios.
I mean, those are some of my biggest bear cases. And those are the ones, I mean, we always review risk factors. Obviously, that's our job. And, the pandemic proving out to be a benefit to the industry was interesting. I mean, it's definitely been difficult from an operational standpoint to manage through it, but I actually think it expedited some things that needed to happen, like order ahead and certain things that actually helped improve the metrics of some of our operators. Instead of having a mass of people in Illinois trying to get through the four walls of a store, we could do order ahead, which drastically improved our velocity of sales. And yeah, anyway, it's just, so for us, it's all, I mean, regulatory and policy risk has always been some of the biggest concerns for us. I'd say a risk I do note is we do have some big companies now kind of being the representatives of this industry, and some of them are great and some of them maybe could behave a little bit better. And I think that I'm worried about some behavior behind the scenes of some operators and that it becomes like held up as a token against the industry. The Tribune tried to do that with GTI, but look how it shook people for 24 hours. That was rough.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So I read it at a high level. It sounded
Yeah.
like the Tribune came out with some story. I don't know the details of it, but they were basically making false claims about GTI.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Ben and GTI came out and basically said this is not true at all. And the Tribune responded by saying, "Okay, well we're gonna investigate further, right?" So what's going on there? What are the specifics?
It's a great question. No, I mean, all I know is that it was unfounded and it was not fact checked, obviously. And it was unsubstantiated. So it's a question mark. I mean, that the Tribune is owned by a fund that also was the owner of the Denver Post, which cut the weed beat, so to speak. Like they cut
Mm,
that. So I don't know. I mean, we could
follow the
conjecture all day
money.
long. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I did find that to be interesting. I'm definitely not saying anything, but it's just like I
sure.
looked at a lot of different ways I was like, gosh, is this coming from a competitor? Like, where is it coming from? When I read it, I was like, there's just nothing here. It's just it just felt like it was very like broad, but the headline was so aggressive. And then the substance of the article was very pathetic.
Right.
So I was just like, I mean, of course I was worried, because I'm always worried. But at the same time, I was like, even the dollar amounts that they were citing, I'm like, that's a rounding error compared to the money that pharmaceutical companies or wine and
Right.
spirits companies or anybody spends to grease the wheels of moving things forward in business. So yeah, so I don't really have any substantial facts on it other than I don't think they would stand up and say retract this if if they didn't feel very confident in their position,
Right.
you
Right.
know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my guess is that we're gonna see more attempts of this, as more lobbying dollars and whatnot are funneled to different entities to discredit the industry because it's thriving right now. We're booming. So I think
Yeah.
that any way to kind of stop that momentum, they're gonna try to do that. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the next question is, what are some of the biggest threats to MSO valuations? And start there. Biggest threat to MSO valuations.
I would say it's going to be about operational efficiency and effectiveness of these companies as they scale. They've been posting some really attractive metrics and they're going to have to keep hitting every quarter. I
Hmm.
think if we see some slips, it's going to be difficult for the sector. So we're going to have to watch that carefully. I'm really glad that the US operators have all shifted to the gap, or not all, but the top ones have shifted to gap financials. I'm glad we're no longer talking about these ridiculous things like funded capacity, but I think that that's a good testament to the fundamentals of these businesses, but they're going to have to keep hitting it. And I'm bolstered by the fact that even long running markets like Colorado are seeing over 20% year over year growth. And that's a 7-year-old market. Like that's
Right.
showing a healthy growth rate, even and especially considering that their tourism market took a huge hit last year from COVID. So that was really organic growth. And I feel like can you imagine the long tail of like a New York State
No,
opening?
I can't.
I
I
mean,
literally
it's
can't.
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and like Florida's medical, for God's sakes. It's not even adult use yet. I mean, there's huge and Texas. I mean, there's so many things that we're going to unlock with this, but the operators have got to keep focus on operational excellence, and that's the only way that they're going to keep the valuations going, and they're going to have to substantiate some of these multiples. But when you look at their multiples versus other sectors, I mean, I think we're looking pretty good. My brother's a huge fan at GARP, like growth at a reasonable price, and I feel he wrote a really cool article about it on our Medium page. But I think that we're getting lower on these multiples again, and things are kind of compressing, but I still think there's a ton of torque in this industry. So, regulatory things could be a hit. Yeah, but otherwise, I think it's for us. We're really focused on our operators that we invest in.
Right, right. No, that's sound advice that you gave. And that torque that you talked about, like, let's talk about industrial hemp for a second, right?
Mm,
Because
hmm.
that's one area where, I mean, we see hemp cultivation for cannabinoid extraction, CBD products, things like that. But the discussion of growing hemp for fiber and herd is insane, right? Because
Hmm.
of all the applications. You got clothing, you've got, like we talked about, houses earlier, plastics for cars, biofuels. I mean, the list goes on and on. So from your perspective, at Poseidon, are you seeing any investments move from cannabinoids to fiber in this year, in 2021?
We are all in on that. I mean, we have an investment in this company called Basscore, which is in Alabama, which is really cool. It's really cool. You should look it up. They do have IP around processing hemp for fiber, for textiles, for plastics, I mean, the huge untold unlocking. And talk about a global supply chain shift to bring back textiles to North America and the US specifically would be huge.
Huge.
I mean, we're having conversations with car part makers because you can use it, which hemp, when it's in that form, has 10 times the tensile strength of steel.
Wow.
And it's so light. It's so like
10
a hemp
times
car
and
panel.
then it's still? I
Yeah.
had no idea. That is
Yeah.
insane.
You can replace, so our batteries are, oh, that's Sprout, my dog. We have, she eats hemp dog treats.
Nice.
So yeah, but, you know, oh, graphite is what makes up the batteries in here, which goes into graphene. But graphite is very expensive and difficult to mine and not great for the environment. And it's part of why these things are so expensive. Hemp can be used in other bast fibers like hemp for graphene, which they're showing, there's studies out of New York in what is it, Clarkson University, about graphene made from hemp, and you can charge a battery in almost no time made from graphene from hemp, and it holds its charge longer. So there's,
Jeez.
I mean, there's a
Wow.
lot to do here, and I feel like, it's just going to, and so what we've invested in is the infrastructure to make sure that it can get to those end uses, because right now it's just hard. You pull it out of the field and what do you do with it? And the current process for manufacturing it in China is to destroy it essentially through chemicals and beating of the plant instead of keeping the long fibers. And so we have a lot of great tests going on with really big fashion brands, and the results are coming back really strong. So I'm unbelievably excited about it. I think it's been difficult to invest in it because it's been very R&D, but I think we will see more and more going into that as it gets more normalized.
Here's just a question of curiosity for you. So in that discussion of industrial hemp and just the amazing, use cases of fiber, right? And the
Mhm.
stock and all that. Is that an easier conversation for quicker entry
Mhm.
for federal legalization, or is it almost counterintuitive to lead with that viewpoint, like of industrial hemp and the benefits, because of the fact that it could in fact replace legacy industries?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think for us to be able to, I think for the US, now that we had this huge scare during COVID where major industries were tested and people were unemployed, I'm hoping there's going to be more of a focus of bringing back industries to the US that we can localize and support and can create jobs. I think that's one way that we can move this forward. And that's one way Alabama has frankly been so supportive of this whole project that Basscore is pursuing. I mean, Alabama has not been a leader in cannabis reform.
Right.
So, I mean, that's where Jeff Sessions comes from. So, I mean, it is a definite entry point. And I can say too, I've spent time lobbying or not lobbying, but walking the floors of the Senate in Mexico, meeting with lawmakers there. They're extremely passionate about industrial hemp,
Mhm.
especially for their textile manufacturing and everything. So it's a truly, I do think it's very easy for lawmakers to get their arms around it because it's just, to them, it's more like a crop.
Right.
A crop that is like agriculture, and you can get your arms around that. And I mean, once you tell someone you could smoke a field of hemp and all you'd have is like a cough. It's not going to be fun for anyone if you smoke a field of hemp, but like
Right.
it really changes everyone's opinion. So I think that one has a lot more legs in very conservative places, and so I think it's a really great, but I don't know, I'm not sure that I think it opens the door for the consumption of cannabis, but I think it's just a whole different conversation. Yeah.
Right. It wouldn't open the door for like cannabinoid therapeutics and the consumption side, but maybe it will remove the stigma that's associated with that side because people see
Yep.
the plant in a different light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah,
So
interesting.
to wrap it up, Emily, I want to ask you, pull out your crystal ball. What are your predictions for the remainder of 2021 when it comes to cannabis in the United States? And what is Poseidon, looking forward to? What does it have planned? Any major M&As or new investments Yeah, the
Ah,
floor is yours.
so crystal ball, I think we're just going to continue to see. I mean, when like we got into this space, there was Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Alaska opened its market like a long time after it was put into law. But and then I just can't even believe it. It's like Arizona started selling adult use cannabis, and I didn't even know they were going to start. I mean, this is how fast
It
things are
was like
changing, and
3 months, wasn't it, or something like that in
so
Arizona?
fast. And all of a
Yeah.
sudden I saw headset being like first adult use sale in our, I'm like, we used to like count down to the first adult use sale in every market. You know, I remember like the night before Illinois opened and Abner was like from Ascend was like sending me text messages from the park. And I was like, this is so amazing. And I have to say, like the other morning when New York passed, I actually got really choked up because I was just like, wow, like this is a huge shift. It is a seismic shift in the progress of this industry. But it's just, but so where I think we go from here is that it just continues to go and go from here.
Hmm.
I think we'll have many more unanticipated roadblocks because we just always do, and the industry will navigate through it. But I think we're going to see a separation of the best operators, and we'll see way more nuanced approaches to how people invest into cannabis. It's not going to be, does that company grow weed? I will invest because it goes up and to the right. No, we are going to be very thoughtful about how we select the companies. We not me, but like generally
Right.
speaking, I think people will be much more thoughtful about their deployment of capital into companies. So I think that we'll vote with our dollars and it will start to support the companies that are doing the best and having that operational excellence that I was talking about earlier. And then I think, you know, personally, we're based in San Francisco. The California market's been a tough market. It is the largest market in the world for cannabis. It's the fifth largest economy in the world. We had an enormous gray market that had to get pushed through a legal framework, and there was no way it was ever going to be easy. It was probably harder than it needed to be, and our tax rates are insane, but I'm starting to see what is gelling to make sense to me. We've invested into this market. I think it's going to be rewarded, and I'm very excited to see some really interesting California companies emerging from this very difficult transition that we went through with legalization here in this state in particular. So I wouldn't sleep on California. I
Awesome.
think there's something to this state.
Absolutely. Emily, this has been a pleasure. I really, really have enjoyed our conversation. You're super knowledgeable and full of insights. And I know that I myself got a lot out of this conversation, and I know for a fact that the audience did as well. So, what do you want to leave the audience with? Final thoughts, and then where can people find y'all's website and social media to learn more?
Yeah. Okay, so website Poseidon.partners, super easy. Our what is our Twitter is at Poseidon Asset, and I'm EMPAX1, I think, on Twitter. And so you can see there's usually some funny exchanges going on between my brother, who's my business partner, and I. And Poseidon will tweet news and updates that it finds to be interesting for people to understand or tries to be funny. And then we're on LinkedIn. You can find us everywhere. It's not hard to find us. But I guess I would just say the thing I would leave people with is that, you know, investing into cannabis is truly, we're really lucky we have the opportunity to do it. And I would say, you know, it's not for the faint of heart, but I think the people who lean in on the space and hang in there will be richly rewarded for their endurance and their and prudence too. You know, we've learned, we know there was a wave of investment and a lot of dollars went into companies that did not shepherd that capital well, but we have a second chance at it, and we'll probably have a third chance at it. But I think it's a great time to be selecting your teams now, for the long run.
I couldn't agree more. Emily, thank you so much again. Pleasure. And as the industry continues to evolve and grow, I'd love to have you back on to just
Okay.
share your insights and keep people informed.
I would love that. Oh, and someone asked on Twitter how I keep my teeth so white. It's just brush them.
I didn't want to ask you that and make it awkward for you, but I did see that. So I'm glad you answered it. There you go.
Just brush them.
All right, you heard it from her. Brush your teeth, people. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Take care.